And I think before I ask the panel their views on Heathrow, I think it'd be quite interesting to see what do the audience think in true question time style. So would you like to raise your hand if you support the Heathrow expansion? So I can count a handful, literally, a handful of hands. I say it literally, a handful. And if you're opposed to the Heathrow expansion, that's really interesting. I mean, it's like, 90% of this audience. I mean, this audience is going to be a bit climate aware, so it's not representative of the population, but that's fascinating. So, to the panel, what do you think? Should we be opposed to Heathrow expansion? I think, Sal, you touched on it earlier, but if you can just say it briefly and then let everybody have a chance.
So, I dug out a few facts about Heathrow. So, one, Heathrow is apparently not at full capacity. There is no safety zone around the proposed third runway. The congestion around Heathrow is already dire. Each flight that goes out of Heathrow is less than 66% full. That means 1 in 3 flights, for example, to New York is already empty. We need to address travel. Most of the business travel that goes out of Heathrow could be readdressed using technology. Then we get on to the scary facts.
Quickly, yes and no.
Quickly facts. So I think people need to deserve to know facts. It's not about yes or no, because the government's pushing it. So 9 people die daily from air pollution in London alone. And that's due to do with not carbon, but as the gentleman said, nitrogen dioxide is a big issue. 12,000 people from 190 businesses will lose their jobs. 783 homes will be demolished. So, like we said earlier about emissions, so the UK is allowed 160 million tonnes of CO2 allowance a year. Heathrow would account for 55% of that if the Kyoto Agreement included CO2. So the reality check is, if aviation continues the way it is unchecked by 2037, the industry will be responsible for all of the carbon that the UK is allowed to emit. Failure to prevent climate change will see at least 1 billion people suffer with water shortages, and 40% of species will become extinct. And sea levels will rise, and that would threaten Heathrow's new terminal, because it would be underwater.
So on a personal level, when I was 5, I flew to Australia to see my older brother. I had no choice in it. When I came back, I was asked to give a talk to my class about how exciting it was to be on an aeroplane. My son, at the age of 8, gets questioned why he's never been on an aeroplane. Please, could we all change our attitude to our right to fly? Because it is not a human right that keeps us alive.
I did some research for an essay at CAT on the MSc that I did there, and the number of people who actually fly is probably 20 or 30% of the population. At the moment, it's supposedly an average of 80%, but that number is made up of people, probably business people, who make 20 or 30 flights a year. And that's impinging on the rest of us. So, as the lady said, business has got all sorts of ways that they can contact people. Perhaps they should start.
Okay, I'm in favour of expansion of Heathrow, and I'm very excited to represent a part of the high-tech Thames Valley economy. I think, as Brian says in his lecture earlier, that transport is the big laggard in terms of cleaning up and decarbonising, and I think the new aeroplanes are much cleaner. And I think that as a company in Newbury called Rock Technologies that does a lot of the Internet of Things, they are, for example, working with Heathrow to try and limit the carbon emissions from aircraft on the ground. There is much more that can be done about cleaning up aircraft in the skies. And I think that we have to be very careful about saying a blanket reason that we don't want another runway at Heathrow, and not thinking about all the implications of this, and not thinking about our own lives. And I talk about the environment and climate change the whole time, but I fly. I rejoice that air travel has brought the world closer together, that people whose families live in Australia can go and see each other. And these are all marvellous things about making a better, safer, more connected world. but there are huge things that we can do to change it. We can use video conferencing, loads of different ways of conducting our lives without flying, and we should be really careful about doing it. We should be able to offset better. I've been looking at offsetting my travel. I have a job with NATO, which means that I have to travel a bit through work, and I'm a bit suspicious, frankly, of some of the offsetting websites I've looked at. I think there's a bit of greenwash going on there. I think we've got to make it easier for people to reduce the impact of our flying, but I want to keep my constituency in the Thames Valley benefiting from the wonderful inflow of investment that we get from a place like Heathrow.
Let me start with a slightly different slant, which is the science of climate change and aviation. There's the direct emissions of carbon dioxide, but there's the biggest other impact is actually the contrails, the condensation trails you see in the sky, which actually have an impact which can be quite large. But if we stopped aviation, they would disappear very quickly. And there's always been a question of how much you should multiply the CO2 by to get the full impact of aviation. But I don't think there'll ever be an agreement on that, so maybe the number one is we'll deal with is just CO2. I was on the Climate Change Committee when we were thinking about the targets, etc., and the recommendation which government accepted was that uniquely in the world, the UK would include aviation in its target. No one else is doing that, international aviation. So we actually have that in our 80% reduction target initially, the target we had before. Aviation was actually in that. And part of that was that we said to government, well, there may be increases in efficiency of aviation, but aviation should not emit any more CO2 than it has in the past. And the implication of that is that we already have enough slots in southern England for aviation, and if Heathrow expands, it means the regional airports will not be able to fill their slots.
Thank you. Personally, I've given up flying. I haven't flown for about 18 months now, and I've signed the Flight Free 2020 pledge, which is online if you haven't seen it. And I would encourage everyone to sign up to that. But I do recognise that some people have relatives on the other side of the world, and you wouldn't want to be in a situation where you can never see them again. But as other panel members have said, there are people who fly a lot, and that's what needs to be reduced, the people who fly regularly. West Berkshire Council currently have a policy which they implemented, I think, in 2014, supporting airport expansion, and they reaffirmed that last July, and the motion said, we support airport expansion because we will get all of the benefits in West Berkshire and none of the downsides. And I think that's an incredibly cynical thing to commit to paper and agree as a council that other people can have their homes demolished and suffer from the air pollution whilst we get the benefits. And also, now that we've declared a climate emergency at West Berkshire Council, we've committed to go carbon neutral by 2030. I don't think it's compatible with that ambition to support Heathrow expansion. We need to have compatible policies ultimately. And I think it just exposes the fact that the council are not serious about reducing carbon by 2030 if they then, a few weeks later, support Heathrow expansion. And just to mention, it's full council this coming Thursday evening down in Newbury, and we will be holding a protest at 6:15 outside the council chamber about Heathrow, because that motion is going back yet again to that meeting. So if you are able to make it, do come along. We'll have student climate activists, Extinction Rebellion, people from all the political parties who are opposed to Heathrow expansion. So please do join us if you get a chance. Thank you.
I do take Richard's points, but I think those discussions need to be taken place, need to take place in the development of this transitional period, this transformation period. But I don't see anything Richard said means that we need to have an expansion of Heathrow. And I think Sir Brian's points are very clear. I mean, I've never supported him. I think there's no justification for Heathrow expansion.
We can't hear you.
Sorry, because he's
Yeah. Sorry. That one's not working.
Okay, basically, you don't have to support the expansion of Heathrow to accept Richard's points about the need for flying for business and so on and so on. I think we need to de-intensify flying and so on, but I never supported the expansion of Heathrow, and I think Sir Brian's points about why it shouldn't expand are pretty clear, so not for me.
So thank you. I mean, I've been looking. One of my responsibilities as leader of Thatcham Town Council is to develop a carbon plan for the town. So one of the things I've been looking into is just what is people's individual carbon footprints. And I was astounded when I was looking at aviation, because on average, a citizen in West Berkshire's carbon footprint is around about 6 tonnes of carbon dioxide. If you take just one flight, one long-haul flight, even not a very long-haul flight to the other side of the Atlantic, that's about 2 tonnes of CO2. If you go to Australia, it's about 6 tonnes of CO2. So we heard earlier from Brian in the church in his presentation that by 2050 we need to get to a level of about 2 tonnes of CO2 per person. Well, if you're going to do long-haul flights, then what are you going to do for the rest of the year? Because that's your limit of your CO2.